war in Ukraine stretches into the new year, concern is growing over the increasingly close relationship between Moscow and Tehran. President Volodymyr Zelensky warning this week that Russia is planning a prolonged attack using Iranian-supplied drones as the Biden administration scrambles to stop future weapons transfers. The Treasury Department announcing new sanctions yesterday on Iran's aviation and defense industries. Let's bring in Behnam Ben Taleblu. He's a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Welcome. Good to see you again. So we first saw Iran and Russia work together in Syria. Now can we say with this action in Ukraine that the two are really now full-fledged wartime allies?
Well, Paul, it's a pleasure to be with you, and a belated Happy New Year. This is a sign of the times that the Islamic Republic is going to continue tightening all sorts of ties, be they political, economic, military, intelligence, cyber, and other kinds of security ties with America's near-peer competitors and great power rivals like Russia and China. You know, yes, they do compete, particularly in the energy sector, the Russians and the Iranians, and yes, there is historical animosity, but the Venn diagram, the shared part of overlapping interests between Putin in Russia and Khamenei in Iran continues to grow. These are two authoritarian, anti-American regimes that are now lending a hand to one another to stay abroad, to stay afloat at home, as well as to continue the war of imperial aggression abroad. They saved Assad, they saved Maduro, and now Khamenei seems to be underwriting Putin's war against Ukraine with drones.
Yeah, well, let's talk in more detail about the extent of that military cooperation. These drones that they're supplying, what's the number that they're supplying, how much of how many, and they're also supplying some ballistic missiles too, I gather.
Well, the exact numbers of each set of transfers are unknown, but the Russians continue to use them in large batches and continue to use them to supplement the long-range strike capabilities that are more expensive to produce at home. So instead of Russia firing its own ballistic missiles or cruise missiles at Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, it can fire cheaper Iranian-made suicide drones, popularly known as kamikaze drones, or technically known as loitering munitions, that take out, hydroelectric plants, energy sites, and even target civilian housing and blocks. So ultimately, this is Iran allowing Putin to stay in the fight longer, to survive the sanctions longer, continue to fight on the cheap. And there is no yet confirmed case of ballistic missile transfers by Iran to Russia, but if it would mark a significant violation of UN Security Council Resolution 2231, as do the drone transfers, and it would be the farthest ranging state-to-state transfer by Iran to date in its own history of a ballistic missile transfer.
One of the advantages of these drones is that they're much cheaper to make than they are to shoot down. It's more expensive, I gather. So Iran can keep supplying these and keep the pressure on Ukraine. And I saw one report that suggested that Iran was actually building a new factory for these drones. Have you seen that?
Yeah, and it's imperative to actually go after the full supply chain. So we know that there are actually even Western components, Western tech inside some of these Iranian drones that are ultimately transferred to Russia. A nightmare scenario would be the Iranians producing these on Russian soil. So before that actually does happen, Washington needs to really step up the pressure against the sale, supply, and transfer networks of these Iranian drones, as well as go after the whole broad procurement, production, and proliferation nodes. And the recent sanctions are a good start. The fact that the European Union now is copy-pasting older U.S. Treasury Department sanctions is also a good start, but this is too little too late, because the Islamic Republic is an asymmetric military power, and it's supplementing Russia's conventional military capabilities, as we see quite brutally in the war in Ukraine.
Well, apart from interdicting or trying to the supply chain, what else can the United States do, and Europe, and for that matter Israel, to stop this flow of arms and keep the pressure on Iran to stop doing this?
Well, there's a broader strategy that would be imperative for the Biden administration to take up to keep the pressure on Iran, which is to snap back those older UN Security Council resolutions on Iran, finally close the door on a deal that would actually end up underwriting the regime's domestic repression and foreign aggression. But that's an entirely separate point. I think there's a 4 to 5 part plan the Biden administration needs to adopt. One is to tighten export controls both in America and in Europe, make sure Iranian illicit business practices are known. The second is to step up those sanctions against against the sales supply transfer networks. The next is to transfer intel about how Iran produces these things, as well as employs them on the battlefield. That's particularly where the Israelis could be helpful. Then there's obviously the legal component, to make sure you have all the legal apparatuses in place if you are able to make an interdiction to make it. And then finally, there's the military component, the offset, to make sure the Ukrainians have both the short-range air defenses, like the CRAM, as well as, the longer-range missile defenses, like the Patriot, to devalue and offset these weapons on the battlefield. If you have just one and not all of these, that would not at all be a silver bullet. It needs to be a cocktail.
Do you think the Iran nuclear deal is finally dead? Reviving that is the president's ambition to revive that. Is that finally gone with this support for Russia from Iran?
We've seen some good, rhetoric out of both the Biden administration and from the Europeans getting tough with the Iranians, but ultimately the nuclear ball still remains in Khamenei's court. That's Iran's supreme leader. It's a title meant to be taken rather literally. The only way for us to know that the Biden administration is really done with the deal is if they close the door on it, formally announce that the deal is dead, and snap back those older UN Security Council resolutions. Until we see that happen, the rhetoric from the administration, most unfortunately, is just rhetoric.
All right, Behnam Ben Taleblu, thank you. Very informative, very much appreciated.